Welcome in, everybody. Mike Johnson, Simone Eli joining you for another edition of Alabama Football Head to Head as we are entering now the month of November. Things are winding down, and as far as the playoff picture is concerned, things are as big as they have ever been. Alabama currently with 2 losses, but the Tide able to get back on track with the win against Missouri. We will discuss that big one at Bryant-Denny a couple of weeks ago and look ahead to the big one in Death Valley on Saturday. Let's go head to head. All right, guys, a little bit of a happier show this week, so to speak. You know, it's always a good week when Alabama is coming off of a win. And, of course, Bama coming off of the bye. They have some extra time as they prepare for a top 20 matchup against LSU. But, Mike, let's touch very briefly on that win against Missouri. This was an Alabama team that was hurting after a second SEC loss, looking to get back on track. They were able to do it at Bryant-Denny Stadium.
Yeah, and I think it was an improved version of Alabama. And I think a lot of people – rightfully so, are going to point to the fact that Drew Pine came in at quarterback for Missouri. But even before he came in for Missouri at quarterback, I thought this was a Bama defense that was playing very well. I thought they played instinctually. It seemed to me like the playbook, for whatever reason, on defense had kind of been pared down a little bit. You still had a lot of the same formations defensively, and that's good because, Missouri was going to throw a lot at you. But I thought the defensive line continued to play well. I think they've been playing well. They've been playing with a level of physicality up front that I think is much needed for this run defense moving forward. And linebackers, a much maligned group that you and I have talked about a number of times throughout the season, specifically after Vanderbilt, a little bit after Tennessee, just playing with a little bit of a hesitant nature that you're not used to seeing from Alabama linebackers. And yet I thought that they triggered well and played really, really good against Missouri. So they were excited. I thought that was nice to see. You get a little bit of that excitement back on defense. I thought Malachi Moore did a nice job of hyping up his teammates around him and making sure that everybody was kind of rallying to the ball. And so that was the main thing I was looking at, right? You preserved the shutout, and obviously there's some back and forth with Eli Drinkwitz there at the end. But nonetheless, nice to see a goose egg on the scoreboard. And this is now a defense that, believe it or not, seems to be kind of growing. And I think that's exciting moving forward this year.
Yeah, and speaking of the defense, Alabama defensive coordinator Kane Womack said something going into that Missouri game that stuck out to me a little bit when asked, how do you keep from looking down the road, looking at implications, doing the math, like everyone does, whether you're a high school football coach or a little league coach, you start looking at the playoffs, you start looking at what does the postseason look like. So Alabama, naturally, after the Tennessee loss, you wonder, are we out? Are we in? Does it matter anymore? What are we playing for? And, Coach Womack said, let's keep the main thing, and that's beating Missouri. I feel as though his guys kind of adopted that mentality, so to speak, everything you just alluded to. And that's really maybe easier said than done. You've coached before, Mike. It's hard to not look ahead and start adding and subtracting and seeing where things line up. And then you lose another one, and then you really are out.
Right. And what's funny is from man to man in that coaching staff, I guarantee that individually they're sitting there looking at the schedule.
Without a doubt. There's no question. Yes.
They're getting, plans lined up for their families to to come to certain games and doing all this kind of stuff. So they know on an individual basis, they might not voice it amongst themselves in the staff meetings, but they know what's coming around the corner as far as the stretch run for Alabama and all the things you have to do to be able to keep your team alive. And so I think that's why it's so exciting to talk about, what you saw against Missouri, because the defense, obviously, like I said, steps up to the plate and is able to get some things done. I think you've had a sour taste in your mouth about this defense a couple of times this year. On the offensive side, not quite what you would expect once you see the scoreboard. I think a lot of people look at it as a negative sometimes, Simone, that you look in the first quarter and no points and you struggle throughout the first half a little bit until the very end. But I think there's some positives to take away from that. And you mentioned I've coached before. I've been in those circles. The fact that you can make adjustments at the end of the first half, right? And in the second half and kind of do those things to get you in the end zone and make sure you're putting points on the board. I think that's a net positive, right? So while you don't want to start slow, at least your coaching staff, your players were able to do some things to be able to get it done in the end. I just think that I think it's a team that's growing, a team that's improving, specifically on defense. I would love to see a little bit more out of the offensive line right now. I think that I was really excited about this group coming into the season. They've hit a little bit of a stalemate in terms of the running game, it seems like recently. But, I think that even they did some good things against Missouri on the ground. And obviously I thought Jam Miller and Justice Haynes ran really, really hard. So you're right. You get to a certain point in the season, you kind of look up and you might see the finish line. And you say, well, if we could do this, if we could do that. I think it's very important, like you mentioned, for Kane Womack and really this entire team to kind of keep their head down, make sure they're improving on a day-to-day basis and taking every rep as if it was their last right now.
How significant is this bye week for Alabama and LSU as well, also coming off of a bye? And we know that when you look at just the overall totality of the implications, we can talk about the playoff implications. We can talk about what this looks like. Alabama sitting with 2 losses. A lot of this is uncharted territory. I think we've discussed that previously on the show. Is we don't know if a 2-loss team is in the 12-team playoff. We don't know what that's going to look like ultimately. And really, a lot of that's probably going to depend on who is in the SEC championship game and who wins and loses there. So when you think about Alabama being a 2-loss conference team right now, you can't suffer another one. Now you head to one of your rivalry games there down in Death Valley. Mike, I do want your biggest memory of playing in Baton Rouge for sure. But this is going to be one of those do or die, at least when it comes to the ultimate goal if you are an Alabama fan, coach, player in the tradition of winning a national title.
Well, there's no doubt about it. And look, I think we would all say that, all these players from Alabama, even though I just said that they were improving, are still getting used to this coaching staff, kind of getting used to this program and the way that everybody goes about things.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the bye week. I think that's why this bye week could not possibly come at a more massive time. When you are coaching and when you're playing, but specifically when you're coaching, you understand players do things in different ways. Some guys like walkthroughs. Some guys want to see it on the board. Some people want to be able to write things down. You kind of soak plays in different things about the football game in different ways. Yeah. I was always the kind of guy that liked the meeting room. I like to see the film. I like when they zoom in on your footwork and they talked about this shell of a defense and 2 high and 8-man boxes and things like that. And I used to do some of my best stuff in terms of growing as a football player in those meeting rooms and sitting down and having those conversations. And also at the same time, Simone, taking those repetitions off your legs. So I think it's really important at a point like this, early November, that you've been able to kind of sit down a little bit, take a deep breath, look at, what's ahead of you and what you need to get done and understand really what this coaching staff is asking of you down the stretch run. So I think it's a massive opportunity for these guys really to soak it all in and make sure they've got their sights focused on being a little bit better down the stretch.
I think it's always interesting to hear you and Cole Kublik, of course, who I do the Auburn show with, discuss the bye week and the significance that comes with the rest on your body. Because I think that sometimes from a fan perspective, even being a former athlete, I didn't play football, college basketball myself, like you enjoyed being off because I didn't want to have to go on the road or, I want to be able to just get back into schoolwork for a second or just kind of recenter my life, say hi to my family for a minute. But when it comes to football and the rest that you need on your body, you guys played up front in the trenches. I mean, you were really getting beat up every single minute. Can you even overstate the significance that comes with just being able to take a deep breath and allow your body to heal and then go into a game such as this one with a refreshed body, a refreshed mind, and just a different perspective, maybe overall, physically and mentally?
Yeah, and what's interesting about it too, Simone, is I remember with Nick Saban, we used to have in the early part of the season a little what we call a mini bye week, where you would basically take a Monday off, take Sunday and Monday off of your legs. And Nick Saban had done so many, studies about this and had talked to so many people that he understood back-to-back days off of your legs. The consequences of that were astronomical just in terms of, just not having one day. I remember back in 2009, we had the Terrence Cody field goal block against Tennessee. And I think that Coach Saban kind of came out afterwards and he said, look, I'm never going to excuse these guys for their performance or whatever else they have going on, but I think they're tired. Like, I think a lot of these guys are absolutely tired. And I can't tell you how many times we'd go through this SEC grind in the schedule. And it felt like things like the cold tub, the IVs, the massages, things like that. It felt like you were just treading water. Like you couldn't ever get ahead of things until that bye week point. And then you come off that bye week, you get back in practice, and you'd be feeling really, really refreshed. So it in terms of just the body, specifically for the offensive line, and as big as these guys and as strong as these guys are nowadays, weighing 350 pounds, I think it's huge. So I don't think you can say enough about it. And we were lucky enough that ours usually comes before LSU, which was always quite a large matchup.
Yeah, no question about that. Love the insight there from Saban and your memories of getting a little bit of much needed off time, which I think that fans and media alike maybe take for granted when you're not actually the one having to go out there and put the reps in. Speaking of LSU, when you look at this game, Mike, we've talked a lot about Alabama's defense really being challenged with mobile quarterbacks. Well, it's going to be a different style guy now in Nussmeier and what he presents. He's a really a true pocket passer type guy. He's put up big numbers. We discussed a little bit. He can also be a liability. When you look at what LSU can present from the offensive side, Alabama's, I think, a 3-point favorite at the point of this recording going into this game. When it comes to, I guess, rivalries and stakes being this high and Death Valley at night, you can kind of throw out any sort of predictions a little bit because you never know what it's going to look like.
Yeah, and I think that this team, honestly, it stresses you in ways that we haven't seen in a while for Alabama. Now, I think just about everybody you've played has had that, that dual threat quarterback. They've obviously struggled with Diego Pavia. Even Nico Iamaleava from Tennessee can move around and run. Garrett Nussmeier just kind of not in that role. But what he is going to do is uncork this ball downfield, and he is almost guaranteed to find 300 passing yards. Now, the good news for Alabama fans in this defense, when you look at it, and I just mentioned the fact that I think the linebackers, defensive line, even the secondary are playing a little bit better of late. Garrett Nussmeier is probably going to throw you a ball or two, right? That's just kind of what his calling card is. He's going to take risky shots down the field. He's going to throw a ball up to you. And if you're Malachi Moore on the back end, you get pretty excited about the thought of some of those balls coming your way. I think, to me, Simone, though, it all comes down to this, honestly, an NFL offensive line for LSU in a lot of ways. Now, it came out this week that they will be missing their left guard, who has started 30-some-odd games for them next to the left tackle, Will Campbell. That's a massive loss, massive loss for LSU. So when I look at the way that this Alabama defensive line matches up against LSU's offensive line, I think maybe you'll see Kane Womack and company try to target that left guard spot, get in Garrett Nussmeier's face, see if you can force some of those gopher balls down the middle of the field, and maybe, just maybe, you'll have a positive in terms of turnovers this weekend.
So this will be a 6:30 p.m. kickoff at Tiger Stadium, which it just always seems like, LSU. I don't want to sound like Lane Kiffin, but it does seem like LSU it gets to play at home in the evening quite a bit. And when you think about this game and this atmosphere, I was just looking up some videos, editing here for our shows at WKRG in Mobile. And you just look at this atmosphere. And I remember walking in as I went to a game as a fan once. I've gone, of course, as a media member, and they're outside the stadium. People are it's just a different type of vibe there in Baton Rouge. If you haven't been there, you can't explain it unless you experience it. What sticks out to you experience-wise, Mike, from your time in Baton Rouge in an Alabama jersey?
Yeah, well, what doesn't? And it's funny, you mentioned the fact that you're down at WKRG. I'm over here in Atlanta. The Falcons are playing the Saints this weekend, which is a huge rivalry game in itself, and they're headed down to New Orleans. And I've had this conversation, it seems like, a few times over the last couple of weeks about the people down in South Louisiana just being a little bit different. No, it's unbelievable. Look, in 2008, we went into Baton Rouge as number 1 ranked team, and with Coach Saban, and it was his first trip back to Baton Rouge as the Alabama head coach after having obviously left there as their head coach a few years prior. And you're right, it's different. Now, we went there in 2006, but we weren't quite as good. As a matter of fact, that's the last time, I think 2006 was the last time that both teams went into this game with multiple losses, which is crazy to think about, almost 20 years ago. But you go to that 2008 game, I distinctly remember they were burning an effigy of Nick Saban next to the bus, or something like that. Like, they're throwing stuff at us. There's craziness coming from the tailgate scene down there in Baton Rouge. It was just a little bit eye-opening. You're just kind of looking around like, this is not going to be a very easy game. And we went down there, and obviously we were a good football team at the time, but that's a tough place to play. They jumped out in front of us. A lot of people remember that 2008 game as the Rashad Johnson game, had 3 picks, had an interception in overtime. And in the end, we win the game on a quarterback sneak. So I can't say enough about the people down there. I loved going to play in Baton Rouge. It's the toughest place I ever played for sure. But you always were going to be due a physical matchup. You knew that they were going to have talent on both sides of the ball. It's particularly in the lines of scrimmage. And man, I'll just never forget that ride into the stadium. And people are just so angry with Nick Saban at that time. It was an interesting deal for sure.
Yeah, when you think about the head coaches currently at these schools, gone are the days of Nick Saban and Les Miles and these, 9-6 final scores and, all those games that just had everyone at the edge of their seat, the yelling game, and just crazy excitement there. But you think about Brian Kelly, and he's still very much new to this conference and kind of came in as I don't want to say unwelcomed favor, but certainly someone who everyone was like, all right, like what can he prove? When you think about this opportunity here, he's a guy who came from Notre Dame, got outsider type, right? Kind of similar to Kalen DeBoer, though I would argue Kalen DeBoer is way more likable and way more personable. And I mean, they're very different.
They're a little bit different, just a little bit.
They're very different in who they are. What I mean is that they have the outsider feel in terms of their SEC background, I guess, recent background, so to speak. And so both of these guys wanting to prove that they belong, in these coaching staffs belong in the SEC, that they can win big games. How big of an opportunity is it from that perspective for these two teams? Win, or your chances of being in the playoffs might be slim to none. And also like, hey, we can do this at a high level in the Southeastern Conference from a coaching staff perspective in a very large top 20 battle between two historically powerhouse programs.
I mean, would it be fair to say that Brian Kelly is still trying to gain favor with the LSU fan base? And I know they won a Heisman Trophy last year down there, so there's something to be said for that. But there is that to me is a marriage that, for whatever reason, has not quite come together on the surface, right? When you look at I don't know if anybody saw the pounding of the fist video earlier this year from Brian Kelly, which just seemed so, out of pocket. It just seemed kind of premeditated. It was have the whole thing. Yeah. You had him talking about his family and the basketball game.
I'm like, dude, if I'm playing for him, I'm like, dude, get out of here with that fake.
I'm with you. So you talk about the accent from the opening game presser. Now I will say this, Simone. I watched Brian Kelly's presser. I don't know if it was yesterday or today. I think it was earlier today. And he was talking about Jalen Milroe. And honestly, I thought there was a sense of confidence actually coming out of Brian Kelly. He kind of mentioned the fact that Jalen Milroe kind of in and out of the starting lineup a year ago with Tommy Reese. You weren't really sure kind of, how they were trying to use Milroe. Was he a runner? Was he a thrower?
Yeah.
That LSU game, honestly, kind of his coming out party, rushed for 4 touchdowns a year ago. And Brian Kelly just kind of mentioned in the presser, like, we didn't really know what he was going to be last year. But he sounded a little bit different when he talked about this season. He was like, look, they want to be able to throw the ball with Jalen Milroe, and why he's a dynamic athlete. It didn't really sound to me like Brian Kelly was that worried about the thought of Jalen Milroe running with his legs. Because when you go down the list of what Jalen Milroe has been and you look at what some of these opponents have been able to hold him to in terms of his legs, it's honestly not great on the whole. And I think that's something Jalen Milroe and Kalen DeBoer and company want to correct. I think that's something they will try to correct this weekend because, truth be told, in the end, I think that this game is going to say a lot about what Jalen Milroe's legacy is at Alabama, right? If you can win this game and move on from it, you got a favorable stretch, the rest of the way. You may not end up in the SEC title game, obviously, but, you could be looking at a college ball playoff berth. If you lose this game and Jalen Milroe struggles, right, and then you kind of struggle down the stretch a little bit, you're not in the playoff, then all of a sudden you're worried about, an Oklahoma or an Auburn jumping up and getting you, then playing what some would call a meaningless bowl game, although I don't feel that way. So there is a lot for Jalen Milroe, I think, riding on this game against LSU. And listening to Brian Kelly today, I almost thought that he sounded just a little bit confident in knowing what Jalen Milroe is and Jalen Milroe's abilities on the ground. So that was something to definitely kind of take in.
One thing about me when it comes to sports and picking games or just how I feel, gut feeling, I'm big on trends. Where is this team trending? Okay. And you look at the Missouri game and you feel, okay, so figure some things out. You mentioned those off the top of the show, a lot of positive things. But when you look at the trend of Alabama on the road in the SEC, this is where I start to have a reservation of what is it about this team that isn't going well when they go on the road in the SEC? Is it a organizational thing? Do guys just get out of their comfort zone? I mean, I'm sure naturally that's going to happen when you're on the road in any conference, but most especially this one. So what is it that needs to go right? And I think part of it is what your start looks like. How fast can you get started? Not only on offense, but on defense as well. Kalen DeBoer said that in his Monday press conference when he was asked, how significant is it going to be to pretty much put the hammer down, I guess, have a quick start. I mean, it's so cliche, but it's true. Have success on both sides of the ball quickly. And he says, it's always the goal. And they didn't have a great start at Vanderbilt. They did get things, corrected to an extent, but ended up in a loss. Tennessee as well, not the way you wanted to start things. So what is your message to guys? And how important is it? I mean, that's such a cliche way to even word that. Of course, it's important to start fast. But it really is important to start fast, too. You know what I'm saying? Like, it sounds cliche, but it's also very important.
Well, and I think that there's a lot that goes into that. First of all, what you can't have is on the first drive, you can't come out and have some kind of false start or miscommunication from the quarterback to the offensive line. And look, I mean, last I checked, I don't know what the updated numbers are after, this bye week, but Bama was near the bottom in the country, not in the SEC, in the country in terms of penalties that they've kind of amassed throughout the season. And a lot of those have, unfortunately, come on the road. And some of them have been the pre-snap variety. Some of them have been, unfortunately, the unsportsmanlike variety at the end of those road games that they lost against Vanderbilt and Tennessee. But I think it's important to kind of iron some of those things out. And I think that's what a lot of, fans that haven't played in this type of environment don't understand is some of these things are just simply a work in progress, right? Yeah. Are you going on a head bob? How long is the head bob going to take? Is there a clap out of the backfield? Is the right or left guard tapping the center on the hip? Now, you can go into these seasons, Simone, with ideas of what that needs to look like, right? You can say, well, this is how we do it in our system. But, there's so many different things that pop up that people don't understand. Maybe the center just can't hear well. Maybe the left guard, he's got a bad knee. Maybe you're playing the backup right guard that has happened at times and you don't want to do a hip tap. Or maybe, it's just, there's a million different situations and it's kind of a moving target along the offensive line in terms of pre-snap penalties and things like that. So I think it's imperative. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned earlier, I love when this bye week has come around. It comes around before a huge season-defining road game against an LSU team that is hungry in and of itself. So I just think that there's a lot of those very, very small, minute details that you can iron out in a time span like that. And hopefully that is what we see on the field when Alabama takes the field. Hopefully we don't see some of the things that have obviously plagued them in some of these road games and the communication and everything else goes off without a hitch.
Well, let's go our predictions as we look at this game. A 6:30 kickoff, a top 20 matchup between two teams that want to stay in the picture for the playoffs. Alabama is 3-point favorite, and I'm going to give my prediction first because I feel strongly that it's going to be that close. I think that Alabama does have guys on their team that have won big games. Let's not forget that they have, gone and played in significant games that LSU, if you think about last year, dropped the ball in several big games. Can Brian Kelly, he hasn't sold me on his ability to be some elite coach or concept guy necessarily in this league. I do like Alabama 24-21, something that's uncomfortable as heck, goes down to the wire. You're pretty much holding your breath till it gets a 0-0 because fans are, pretty much going to run onto the field like they did 2 years ago when he went for 2 there in overtime. So I think it's going to be close. I do think Alabama pulls it out, stays in the playoff hunt, and then you roll the dice on the rest of the year. Mike, what do you like when this woman goes final?
I think you're right in the ballpark. I was going to go 27-24. Actually, I think a couple of field goals for Alabama are the difference. And I think this is a really tight one all the way throughout. I think that when you have a guy like Garrett Nussmeier, and I mentioned Garrett Nussmeier is going to throw for 300 yards. There's just no two ways around it because he's going to uncork it every time he drops back. Can you get pressure up the middle? Can you force the interceptions and things like that on the back end? They've got playmakers. They do. They have a number of skill guys you feel like can beat you if you're not careful. Alabama's secondary is going to have to be up on the task for that one. But I'm with you. I'm in the ballpark, 27-24. I do think that one of the things I will be paying close attention to is, again, how many rushing yards does Jalen Milroe have and how many yards per carry is that? Because that was a huge factor in what they did last year against LSU. And when you look at really his best games throughout his time at Alabama,
Yes.
It's been when he can get in the end zone with his legs. And so I think that's going to be a huge indicator, not just of what's happening this weekend, but what can happen for Jalen Milroe down this stretch run, towards the end of his tenure as Alabama's quarterback. So that's what I'll be looking for. And I think you're really close to feeling like I am, which makes me a little bit nervous, but 27-24 nonetheless.
You should be nervous because Lord knows I have no idea how to pick games. We have made that very clear this season. But there's no doubt Alabama goes as Jalen Milroe goes. We know the success he can have on the ground will certainly equate to wins for Alabama a lot of the time. So we will see. Can Alabama get it done against LSU in a game that has as much meaning in terms of postseason implications, national championship implications for both teams as it ever has? We will see, guys. This has been fun. Looking forward to next week as we really do hit the final stretch. But for Mike Johnson, I'm Simone Eli. This has been Head to Head, and we will see you next week.
Brought to you by Alabama Beef Farmers and Ranchers.